Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are embarking on the first part of a multi-part deep dive.
That's right.
We're looking at a really specific period and location within the Eritrean armed struggle.
Yeah.
And this exploration is drawn, well, exclusively from one source.
Yes, exclusively. The material shared with us from Shabbat.
That's the key thing here. For this deep dive, our entire focus is on understanding the narrative, the facts, the perspective presented solely by this particular Shabbat source.
Exactly. We're zeroing in on the events it describes from, well, roughly the mid-1970s, leading into 1978 and early 1979.
And we really want to make this absolutely crystal clear to you, our listener, right from the start. Everything we talk about today, every piece of information, every strategic insight, it comes directly and only from this Shabbat source material. We're here to unpack its account for you.
Indeed. Think of this as like part one of a three-part journey through this specific Shabbat source.
All right. Part one of three.
And in this initial deep dive, our mission is really to lay the groundwork, to understand the initial dynamics described, the major shifts in external support, the early strategic decisions made by the forces involved, and, well, the consequences that unfolded, all as presented in this source.
Okay, so let's jump right in and unpack this material together, starting with how this Shabbat source sets the scene in the mid-1970s.
Right.
It paints a picture of the Eritrean armed struggle at this time, stating they were actively gaining, both military skills and hardware.
And this growing capability, as the source describes it, it stood in stark contrast to the state of the Ethiopian army specifically stationed within Eritrea during this period.
How so?
Well, the source uses pretty strong language. It calls this Ethiopian army extremely weakened.
Extremely weakened. That's significant for an army that had, maintained control for a long time. Why? Why, according to this source, was the Ethiopian army in Eritrea so weakened back then in the mid-70s?
Okay, so the source points directly to the withdrawal of massive financial and military support. Aid it had previously received from its Western patron, primarily the United States.
The U.S. connection fading.
Right. And what this source highlights is a critical turning point. It notes the internal turmoil within Ethiopia itself.
Yeah, the fall at Haile Selassie.
Exactly, that overthrow of the long-standing regime.
Yeah.
And this internal instability coincided with that change in external relationships.
Right.
The source explicitly links the unrelenting attacks carried out by the Eritrean armed struggle. And it specifically mentions the Eritrean People's Liberation Army, the EPLF.
Okay.
It links those attacks to exposing the already fragile and weakened state of that Ethiopian army stationed in Eritrea.
So as the narrative in this source unfolds for the mid-70s, you sort of see a perfect storm brewing, right? From the perspective of the Ethiopian forces in Eritrea, their long-standing lifeline of Western military aid gets cut. They're dealing with the fallout of a major political upheaval back home.
Yep.
And at the same time, they're facing increasingly capable and persistent attacks from the Eritrean Liberation Forces, especially the EPLF.
Exactly.
So how does the source portray this initial moment, this, confluence of factors impacting the balance of power on the ground?
It's presented as a clear moment of advantage for the Eritrean forces. The source suggests that the disruption of the traditional power dynamic,
Right.
which was heavily skewed by decades of Western, particularly U.S., backing for the Ethiopian military, it created a crucial opening.
An opening.
Yeah. This period, as described by the source, was ripe for the Eritrean forces to capitalize on the Ethiopian army's vulnerability and, begin to gain significant ground.
So the weakening wasn't just abstract politics.
No, the source frames it as a direct, tangible military reality on the ground in Eritrea, tied specifically to the loss of that critical external support.
And the source specifically highlights the EPLF's strategic approach during this time. It describes their military strategy as being focused on liberating the people and the land step by step.
That phrase, step by step, it's interesting as presented in the source.
How so?
It doesn't suggest large, immediate offensives aimed at capturing vast swaths of territory overnight.
Oh, okay.
Instead, it implies a more deliberate, perhaps methodical process, gradually expanding control, consolidating gains, building influence among the population alongside, territorial liberation. It points to a calculated, patient strategy.
And the results of this step-by-step approach, according to the source, were pretty remarkable in a relatively short time frame.
Yeah.
It states that between January 1977 and January 1978, just 1 year, the EPLF managed to bring the largest parts of Eritrea under its control.
Wow, in just a year. The source even provides a quantitative measure of this success. It states that almost 80% of Eritrean territory was brought under EPLF control during this one-year period.
Almost 80%. And it's specific about what remained outside of this control, right?
It is. The source lists the exceptions. Asmara, Asab, Adikai, Burantu. It lists Asmara a second time, actually. And parts of Massawa. These were the key urban centers and ports, basically.
So this raises a crucial strategic picture painted by the source.
Yeah.
By controlling nearly the entire countryside, that 80% of the territory, while leaving only a few scattered towns in enemy hands.
Yeah.
The EPLF effectively created a situation where the Ethiopian army units were confined to these urban centers. The source explicitly states that the Ethiopian army in these remaining towns was awaiting its fate, encircled.
Encircling them. Imagine that situation from a military perspective, purely based on the source's description.
Right.
You control the vast majority of the land, the movement, the supply routes between those towns. The enemy is isolated in these pockets.
It really paints a picture drawn directly from this Shabbat source of the Eritrean forces, particularly the EPLF, achieving a position of significant dominance on the ground by early 1978.
This initial phase of the conflict, as presented in this material, was characterized by substantial gains for the Eritrean side, capitalizing on that weakened state of the Ethiopian army following the withdrawal of its key Western patron.
Now, the source takes us back slightly in time again just to elaborate on this critical shift in external support for the Ethiopian side.
Okay.
It notes that during the era of Emperor Haile Selassie, the Ethiopian army's strength was built and maintained by Western countries, primarily the United States.
Right.
And it adds that, to some extent, Israel was also involved in arming them.
But, as the source explains, everything changed after the monarchy was overthrown. Overthrown by what the source refers to as the allegedly Marxist military clique, known as the Derg.
The Derg.
Following this political transition, the source states that the winds started to blow from east.
A vivid metaphor.
It is. The source uses it to describe the shift in Ethiopia's geopolitical alignment and, sources of support.
And why this dramatic reorientation? The source is pretty clear. The Derg's initial attempts to secure continued military support from their former Western patron, the U.S., were, well, hopeless.
Hopeless. So the door to Western military aid had effectively closed, forcing the new regime to seek assistance elsewhere.
And this is where the source introduces the Soviet Union's role.
The Eastern Bloc steps in.
Exactly. It portrays Soviet Russia as being strategically opportunistic, on a constant watch out for strategic spots around the world. Seeing the situation in Ethiopia, a major African nation, significant geopolitical importance, now politically adrift and needing military backing.
Yeah.
The source says they swiftly moved to bring the disillusioned Ethiopian military gang into their orbit. And the source underscores the strategic significance of where this was happening, describing it as one of the most strategic parts of the world.
So the source frames the Soviet intervention not merely as, ideological solidarity, but fundamentally as a calculated, pragmatic move by the Soviet Union.
Right, to expand its strategic influence in a key global region.
And the source details the timeline. Secret negotiations between the Derg and the Soviets began in 1976. Culminating in a formal military pact signed in 1977.
Setting the stage.
This laid the groundwork for a massive infusion of support.
And when the source describes the scale of the Soviet intervention that followed this pact, the language it uses is striking. It calls this the first largest military intervention in the African landmass since World War II.
Wow, that's a monumental claim, highlighting the sheer magnitude of what was about to happen and its historical significance from the source's perspective.
And this massive intervention had devastating consequences, according to the source. It states unequivocally that it prolonged the suffering of the Eritrean and Ethiopian people for another decade and more.
So the source directly attributes the continuation and escalation of the conflict to this external factor.
Absolutely. And it provides specific figures that really drive home the scale of this new Soviet commitment. It states that between 1977 and February 1978 alone, just over a year, the Soviet Union shipped arms worth $1 billion to Ethiopia.
$1 billion in late 70s money.
$1 billion. And the source makes a point of adding that this figure is, without adding the arms that followed in later years, implying the total value was far higher.
Just think about that number. $1 billion in military hardware back then. That's astronomical. What does this single figure, presented by the source, tell you about the level of commitment, the resources, the strategic importance the Soviets placed on propping up the Derg regime and enabling its military campaigns? It suggests a total shift in global power dynamics playing out directly on the ground in Eritrea.
Absolutely. It's not just the hardware either, is it?
No, no. The source also details the personnel support that accompanied these shipments. It states that hundreds of military officers arrived from Russia, Cuba, East Germany, and South Yemen.
And these weren't just observers.
No. Their mission was to train and advise the Ethiopian army, bringing modern military doctrine and operational expertise to bear.
And the source adds a related detail that reinforces the overall picture of massive Soviet bloc support being mobilized for Ethiopia at this time.
What's that?
It notes that 17,000 Cuban troops also arrived to aid the Ethiopian army concurrently, specifically on the Somali front.
Ah, okay. So not in Eritrea itself, but showing the scale of commitment.
Exactly. While this wasn't on the Eritrean front, the source includes it to show the immense scale of the external military commitment to Ethiopia during this period.
Right. So to summarize this pivotal section from the source, the withdrawal of Western support left the Ethiopian army in Eritrea vulnerable.
Leading to those significant Eritrean gains we talked about.
Exactly. But this was dramatically reversed by the entry of the Soviet Union, which the source portrays as a calculated strategic move of immense scale.
Right.
Bringing unprecedented levels of military aid and personnel, fundamentally altering the balance of power, and, in the source's view, significantly prolonging the conflict and the suffering it caused.
Okay. Now, as the Derg, newly backed by this massive Soviet intervention, begins to prepare its counteroffensive to retake the lost territory, the source offers a really interesting insight into how the Derg regime viewed the various armed groups it was facing. It notes that the Derg never took the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, and the Eritrean Liberation Front, ELF, seriously.
Not seriously. Why is that?
Well, the source provides specific reasons, particularly regarding the ELF. It states that the ELF was, at that time, mired in a vicious and reckless power struggle that finally destroyed it.
Okay, so internal conflict neutered the ELF, according to the source.
That's how the source puts it. Attributes the ELF's diminished threat directly to its internal divisions and conflicts.
And what about the TPLF?
For the TPLF, the source's description is concise, almost dismissive. It simply states the TPLF was barely a couple of years old, an infant military and political force.
Infant force. So, according to the source's depiction of the Derg's perspective, neither the ELF nor the TPLF were seen as significant threats compared to the main adversary.
Right. And this assessment, as described by the source, had a critical strategic consequence.
Which was?
It left the EPLF as the only force and target.
Ah. So the Derg concentrated its resources and planning primarily on confronting the EPLF, viewing them as the principal military challenge in Eritrea.
That's the implication. And the source gives us a sense of the EPLF's strength at this moment, right before the major counteroffensive, just to highlight the asymmetry they faced.
Okay, what does it say?
It states the EPLF had little more than 14,000 manpower equipped with light and medium arms.
Okay, hold that number, 14,000 personnel with light and medium arms in your mind when we talk about the force the Derg was mobilizing with Soviet backing.
Yeah.
The source summarizes this stark contrast bluntly. With no one to count on from outside for help to the EPLF, the military balance was far from symmetrical.
Far from symmetrical feels like a bit of an understatement, doesn't it?
Definitely. When you consider a force of 14,000 facing the kind of military machine $1 billion in arms and hundreds of advisors can build, the source then describes the EPLF leadership's clear-eyed realization of this overwhelming imbalance. It states they were acutely aware of this harsh reality.
They knew what they were up against.
Absolutely. According to the source, they understood that engaging the Ethiopian and Soviet onslaught was both a military nonsense and political suicide.
Military nonsense and political suicide. That's powerful language. What does the source imply by that?
It's used by the source to convey the gravity of the situation as perceived by the EPLF leadership. It signifies that a conventional stand-up fight against this massively resupplied and advised enemy would not only be militarily futile and nonsense that would lead to certain defeat, but would also politically destroy the organization and the entire cause, a suicide. It implies the very survival of the Eritrean armed struggle was at stake.
And this grim assessment led directly to what the source describes as a pivotal and, well, famous decision.
Which was?
To ensure the continuity of the Eritrean People's Armed Struggle, the EPLF decided for the famous strategic withdrawal of 1978.
The strategic withdrawal. The source carefully frames this not as a retreat born of defeat, but as a calculated strategic maneuver.
Explain that.
Well, a strategic withdrawal, as the source implies, is about deliberately ceding ground, abandoning hard-won territory, specifically to preserve the fighting force, its leadership, and its capacity to continue the struggle over the long term.
So survival was the key.
The primary goal, explicitly stated by the source, was to ensure the continuity of the armed struggle itself, recognizing that holding territory was unsustainable in the face of the overwhelming force described, and that the survival of the movement was paramount.
Think about the immense difficulty of making such a decision, though.
Oh, yeah.
You've just spent years liberating almost 80% of the territory, building control and legitimacy on the ground.
Yeah, hard-won gains.
Only to face a threat so overwhelming that the only rational military choice, according to this source, is to pull back from most of those gains, to give up the land you fought for solely to preserve the ability to fight another day.
That requires not just strategic foresight, but immense discipline and belief in the long-term objective, as this source portrays it.
Okay, so with the strategic withdrawal completed, the stage is set for the Derg's massive counteroffensive.
Right.
The source notes that by the time the Derg was fully prepared, in mid-1978, the situation on the ground was that almost 80% of the Eritrean territory was under the control of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front and the Eritrean Liberation Front.
With the key towns still under Ethiopian control. It's interesting, like you said, that the source mentions both EPLF and ELF here, controlling territory right before the offensive.
Yeah, despite saying the ELF was weakened.
Right. It suggests that even if weakened, the ELF still maintains some presence or control in certain areas at this specific moment, according to the source's account anyway.
Regardless of the internal dynamics, the force the Derg amassed to retake this territory, as detailed by the source, was immense.
Oh, immense.
Their plan was ambitious. To attack the EPLA simultaneously from 5 directions.
5 directions, wow.
And the numbers the source provides for this mobilized force are just staggering. We're talking about 6 Army Corps.
6 Corps.
Comprising a total of 38 infantry brigades, 6 mechanized brigades, and 10 artillery battalions.
38 infantry brigades. That's huge. A single brigade can be several thousand soldiers.
Exactly. So 38 infantry brigades alone represent a massive ground force.
And it wasn't just land forces, was it?
No. The source notes this offensive was supported by a navy equipped with modern combat and transport ships.
Suggesting amphibious capabilities or sea logistics?
And an air force fielding 5 squadron jet fighters. This indicates a well-resourced, multi-dimensional military operation.
A truly combined arms effort. And the level of strategic planning guiding this massive force is highlighted by the source's note that the entire military strategy was drafted by experienced Soviet generals.
Right. This wasn't just thrown together. It was a sophisticated plan designed by seasoned military professionals with significant resources behind them.
So the source states this offensive began by mid-June 1978 in all 5 directions simultaneously.
And given the scale.
Well, the sheer scale meant that, initially, the Derg was successful in achieving its primary objective of regaining territory. The source states they were able to bring back much of the liberated parts of Eritrea under its control again.
So the strategic withdrawal didn't prevent the loss of territory in the face of this overwhelming offensive.
No, it seems not. However, and the source stresses this point, the Derg didn't do so easily as it was forced to pay heavily. They regained ground, but at a significant human and material cost.
Okay, so it wasn't a walkover.
Far from it. And this leads to a crucial timeline detail provided by the source. The Derg launched this offensive with the expectation, or perhaps the intention, of wiping out the Eritrean fronts within a short period, 2-3 months, the source said.
A quick victory.
That was the plan, maybe. But the source immediately contradicts this by stating that by the first 2 months it was too late for its mission.
Too late. Why?
Because, according to the source, they spent those initial months locked in a relentless fighting with the Eritrean fronts.
So, despite their massive advantage in arms and numbers, the resistance they faced, even from a force that had strategically withdrawn, was tenacious and effective enough to completely throw off their anticipated timeline for a quick victory.
Exactly. The source notes that both the Soviet and Ethiopian generals involved were quick in realizing that the war was heading into becoming a protracted one.
A long war.
This realization, stemming from the heavy fighting and failure to achieve a rapid conclusion, forced them to change gear, as the source puts it.
Change gear how?
Well, according to the source, changing gear meant bringing in additional Soviet advisors to bolster their planning capacity and embarking on devising a new war strategy for a second offensive.
So back to the drawing board.
Pretty much, this shows a clear adaptation on the part of the Derg and their Soviet allies. The first massive push failed to end the war quickly, despite regaining territory, so they had to bring in more expertise and plan for a longer, sustained conflict that would require further major offensives.
Okay. As the Derg began preparing for this second major offensive, what was the EPLA doing? How does the source describe their defensive positioning?
Right. The source states the EPLA organized itself into 4 fortified fronts, although the account immediately focuses on 3 key locations where the enemy offensive struck in November 1978.
And where were these?
These defensive positions, as detailed by the source, were located on the Eastern Front near and around Asmara and Massawa, a second front covering the northern outskirts of Asmara stretching from Drefo up to Adi Yacob, and a third in the Barca region around Angren.
What's the strategic logic here, and what does fortified fronts mean in this context, according to the source?
Well, these areas seem to cover key approaches to important cities like Asmara and Massawa, or vital regions like Barca. Fortified fronts suggests prepared defensive lines.
Like trenches.
Potentially trenches, bunkers, other fixed defenses, designed to absorb and resist the kind of large-scale assault the EPLA knew was coming.
And the second offensive hits these fronts in November 78.
That's what the source says. And given the overwhelming disparity in forces we've already discussed, it's not surprising that the Derg, taking advantage of its arms and manpower superiority, was able to break the EPLA lines.
Did the source mention how they did that? Any specific tactics?
It does, actually. It states they succeeded by stretching the trenches, making it impossible for the EPLA to cover it.
Stretching the trenches. Can you explain that based on the source's description?
Sure. If the defenders have limited manpower spread along a trench line, right,
Okay.
a larger attacking force can concentrate its numbers on a wider front. This effectively dilutes the defender's strength along any given point, making it impossible for them to adequately cover the entire length of their fortified positions.
Creating weak points.
Exactly. Weak points that the attackers can exploit to break through.
Okay, so using this tactic and their sheer numbers, the Derg breached the EPLA lines.
That's right. Consequently, the source says, the EPLA was forced to withdraw.
But knowing the pattern, the story probably doesn't end there.
Not according to the source, no. The EPLA, while forced to retreat from its fortified positions, didn't simply run. The source states that the EPLA draw the enemy into several ambushes as they withdrew.
Ambushes again. Does it say where?
Yes, it names specific locations where these costly ambushes took place, including in a labored and Mamide, which it later refers to as Maamide and as Hara.
And what was the impact of these ambushes even during a withdrawal?
Substantial, according to this source. It states that in these specific ambush locations, the enemy has lost thousands of troops, hundreds of armored vehicles and artillery.
Thousands of troops, hundreds of vehicles. That's a heavy price.
It is. This detail is crucial. It paints a picture drawn directly from the Shabbat source of the EPLA conducting a disciplined fighting withdrawal.
Giving ground but making it hurt.
Exactly. Forced to give ground due to superior numbers and firepower, but inflicting a heavy price on the advancing enemy, turning their retreat into a series of traps. Imagine the tension of this phase. Ceding territory meter by meter, turning to strike hard at the pursuing force when the terrain or opportunity allowed, making the enemy pay dearly for every kilometer gained. This fighting style, described here, highlights the EPLA's tactical adaptability and determination, even facing overwhelming odds.
So these heavy losses the Derg suffered in those ambushes, Ela Bird, Mamidamidamide, Izhara, did they have a bigger strategic impact, according to the source?
Yes, a direct and significant one, as presented by the source. It states that the enemy's primary objective for this offensive phase,
Which was?
to capture the main base of the EPLF by controlling Alphabet and Nakfa and fighting its way through Marsa Tekle, that objective was ultimately discouraged.
Discouraged. Why?
The source explicitly attributes this change in plan, this discouragement, to the Derg's heavy loss and defeat experienced in those specific ambush locations.
So the ambushes work strategically, not just tactically.
That's what the source shows. The EPLA's defensive maneuvers, including the costly ambushes inflicted during their strategic withdrawal, directly impacted the enemy's higher-level strategic objectives, forcing them to rethink their approach towards the EPLF's core area.
And the direct result of failing to achieve this key objective, according to the source.
A shift in the Derg's planning for the future. From 1979 onwards, the source states, the Derg focused on preparing for its third offensive.
A third offensive already.
The fact that, despite launching two massive, well-resourced offensives and regaining significant territory, the conflict was so far from over that the enemy had to commit to planning a third major offensive. It reinforces the source's earlier point about the war becoming protracted.
Right, and highlights the EPLA's resilience.
Exactly. While forced back, they prevented the enemy from achieving that decisive knockout blow.
Okay. The source then describes the situation after this second offensive was pacified. Interesting word. Pacified. Maybe meaning it just fizzled out rather than ended decisively.
Could be. It implies it concluded or lessened in intensity, yeah.
And the EPLA, preparing for the inevitable next push, built two defense lines in key locations. Where were these?
According to the source, these new defensive setups were established on the eastern lowlands, specifically fortified in areas described as Mayamide and Azhara, maybe revisiting some of those ambush locations.
Possibly. And the other line.
Along the critical Karen alphabet axis where positions were established in Genphilim.
Genphilim. And the source states that when the Derg's third offensive began in late January 1979, EPLA units stationed at Genphilim were initially successful.
That's right. From this position, they were able to block the third enemy offensive any further in that direction. So the prepared defense lines were effective against a frontal assault from Genphilim.
But the enemy adapted, right?
They did. Learning from previous setbacks and showing adaptability, they didn't just keep throwing forces against the static Genphilim line. The source describes a key countermaneuver.
Which was?
The enemy maneuvered away its troops and mechanized units through landing crafts into Marsa Tekle and Mamimet, respectively.
A sea landing. That's a critical detail. Bypassing the land defenses.
Exactly. Attacking from the coast. Marsa Tekle and Mamimet are coastal locations, and using landing craft allowed them to project significant numbers of troops, even mechanized units, vehicles, tanks directly into a potentially less defended area behind the established front lines.
A significant tactical adaptation by the enemy, as presented by the source.
Definitely. But what's particularly striking here is the EPLF's foresight, as described by the source.
Oh, so?
Even though their main defenses were inland at Genphilim and the eastern lowlands, the source states the EPLF never ruled out the possibility that the enemy could come through the sea.
So they anticipated this kind of flanking maneuver.
It seems so. Because they anticipated it, the source says the EPLF has always stationed 2 battalions around Marsa Tekle and Mamimet.
Just 2 battalions, though.
Yeah, maybe not a massive force compared to the enemy's corps and brigades, but simply having units positioned in these coastal areas demonstrates a strategic awareness of the vulnerability.
Hedging their bets.
A calculated decision to hedge against a possible sea landing, even if the force wasn't initially strong enough to stop a major assault.
And the consequence of the enemy successfully landing significant forces in Marsa Tekle and Mamimet was immediate and strategically impactful, according to the source.
Yes. This movement towards the northeastern Sahel area directly threatened the EPLA's existing positions further inland. As a result, the source states the EPLA was forced to withdraw its units in from Mamimet.
Because their flank was exposed.
Likely, yeah. And the source highlights the severe danger this landing posed. It notes that because the EPLA units already stationed around Mamimet and Marsa Tekle were not strong enough to stop the influx, enemy troops easily moved toward the main base of the EPLF.
Threatening their headquarters.
Yeah.
An existential threat.
Exactly. The source emphasizes the immediate necessity. In order to move the base away to safety, it was mandatory to chase away the Ethiopian troops first. You couldn't relocate a vital HQ with the enemy bearing down on it.
So they had to counterattack.
Right. This pressing need led to an immediate EPLA counteroffensive in the coastal area. The source states that in the first 2 weeks of February 1979, EPLA troops launched this counteroffensive.
And the result?
They succeeded in chasing away the Derg into the plains from the area around Marsa Tekle and Mamimet.
So this counteroffensive, as described by the source, was a vital tactical action driven by strategic necessity.
Correct. It wasn't about permanently holding the coastal ground, but about neutralizing the immediate threat to the base. buying the time and space needed to move the base to a more secure location and preserve the EPLF's command and control capabilities.
And is what happened after this crucial counteroffensive and the successful relocation of the base that marks a major development described by the source.
What was that?
After moving its primary base to new locations, which the source lists as Jaragrazmara, Kibruet, Halibut, and Erig, the EPLF, then took a significant organizational step. It established the Northeastern Sahel Front.
Ah, the formal establishment of that front. The source provides the initial scale of this new front.
It does, stating that in its first existence, it stretched for approximately 40 kilometers in length.
40 kilometers? But this is just the beginning, right?
Exactly. The source explains that following various subsequent battles and strategic maneuvering, this newly established front underwent a significant expansion. It was connected with the Nakfa Front and the Sudanese border.
Connecting Nakfa and the border. And the result of this expansion, as detailed in the source.
The creation of a massive continuous front line that measured around 667 kilometers in total length.
667 kilometers. Think about that transformation described by the source.
It's huge.
What began as a necessary military reaction to an enemy sea landing, requiring a counteroffensive simply to allow a strategic base relocation, quickly evolved into a major, formalized, and immense front spanning hundreds of kilometers. This Northeastern Sahel Front, born out of necessity and strategic adaptation, connected vital areas like Nakfa and the border with Sudan, becoming a central theater of the war according to this source's narrative.
Okay, parallel to these events leading to the Sahel Front, the source describes related, simultaneous developments happening near Alphabet and Nakfa during this period.
Right. What was going on there?
It states the EPLA was also forced to withdraw to hide a river from Alphabet.
Another withdrawal, but following the pattern.
Exactly. Similar to the strategy employed during the 1978 withdrawal, the source notes that after inflicting a heavy blow on the enemy during this withdrawal from Alphabet, the EPLA then established and held permanent positions in and around Mountain Dendon and the peaks attached to it.
So exacting cost during retreat, then establishing strong defensive footholds in strategic high ground, Mountain Dendon.
And the source specifically highlights the enemy's relentless action focused on Nakfa. It states the Derg resorted to blanket shelling of Nakfa.
Blanket shelling, indicating a sustained, indiscriminate bombardment of the town itself. What makes Nakfa stand out in this account?
The source gives it a unique status, describing it as the only town that would never come under its control ever after.
Wow. Never come under its control. That phrase, as presented in the Shabit source, elevates Nakfa to a symbol of unwavering resistance.
It does. Why did the enemy feel the need for constant heavy shelling? And why was holding this specific town and the surrounding strategic high ground like Dendon described by the source so vital to the EPLA that they fought fiercely to maintain their positions nearby?
It clearly held immense strategic, practical, and maybe symbolic importance throughout the conflict narrative presented here.
The source also mentions a specific EPLA action that underscores their commitment to this area. On 13 February 1979, shortly after the events leading to the Sahel Front, EPLA units launched a counteroffensive near Nakfa. The purpose, according to the source, to chase away the enemy so that they can strengthen their positions peacefully.
Interesting. Not about capturing territory, but about creating breathing room, security around their crucial defensive positions near Nakfa.
Exactly. Now, this period also marks a significant maturation and reorganization of the EPLA's military structure, as described by the source.
How so?
It notes that during the preceding 8 months of protracted war, essentially the period of the strategic withdrawal and the first 2 offenses EPLA units had been fighting, according to the demands of battle, not military science.
Okay, what does the source mean by that? Fighting according to the demands of battle.
Well, it suggests units were deployed and fought primarily based on the immediate needs and pressures of the ongoing battles, reacting tactically to the situation.
Or more fluid, maybe?
Rather than being structured and deployed according to a more rigid, formalized military doctrine or scientific plan based on established fronts.
Okay, I see. But the source states that with the establishment of fronts, however, they were organized accordingly.
Right. This creation of defined, formalized fronts, like the vast Northeastern Sahel Front and the Nakfa Front, allowed for a shift towards a more structured and organized deployment of forces based on military science, as presented by the source.
A move towards more conventional organization. The source details how the EPLA units were organized within this new structure.
Yes. They were stationed in the Northeastern Sahel Front and Nakfa Front, proportionally. This indicates a deliberate allocation of available manpower to these two major defensive sectors.
And does it give specifics, like which units went where?
It does. It provides specific details about which brigades were assigned where. On the Nakfa Front, it lists the 51st, 58th, 70th, and the 8th Brigade, noting the 8th was later renamed the 77th Brigade.
Okay. Nakfa Front, 51, 58, 70, 8, 77. What about the Sahel Front?
On the Northeastern Sahel Front, the initial brigades listed are the 23rd, 4th, and 31st.
23, 4, 31.
The source also mentions the 44th Brigade was later placed in the Northeastern Sahel Front, specifically after the 5th enemy offensive, which is a detail that looks ahead but confirms its eventual role on this front.
Gotcha. And they're mechanized units.
Even those were distributed. The source states that the 76th Mechanized Brigade split its forces, placing 2 battalions on the Northeastern Sahel Front and 1 battalion on the Nakfa Front.
Right. This level of detail from the source really shows the formalization and specific allocation of forces to these major front lines by early 1979.
Now, to understand the situation on these newly established fronts, it's essential to look at the forces arrayed against the EPLA, as described by the source. The DERG also heavily equipped its Northeastern Sahel Front.
Makes sense. What does the source say they put there?
It details the composition of the main enemy force on this front, the 505 Arms Corps. And mirroring the EPLA's new structure, this was a significant multi-unit formation.
The 505 Corps and its makeup.
The source provides the breakdown, again highlighting the significant disparity in heavy weaponry compared to the EPLA's light and medium arms.
Okay.
The 505 Arms Corps comprised 8 infantry brigades and 2 mechanized brigades.
10 brigades total on that front for the DERG.
Right. And crucially, it was supported by 2 artillery battalions equipped with over 80 artillery pieces of various calibers, 122 millimeters, 85 millimeters, and 76 millimeter.
80 artillery pieces.
Wow. Plus, 2 tank battalions fielding over 60 tanks, and 1 battalion equipped with 12 BM-21 artillery pieces.
BM-21s, those are the multiple rocket launchers, right?
Yeah.
Devastating firepower.
Exactly. So let's pause and compare the picture the source paints here.
Yeah, let's. On one side, the EPLA brigades we listed, 23rd, 4th, 31st, eventually 44th, plus 2 battalions of the 76th Mechanized, equipped mostly with light and medium arms positioned within these new fortified fronts.
And on the other side, on the same Northeastern Sahel Front, the DERG's 505 Corps, 10 brigades total, 8 infantry, 2 mechanized.
Supported by over 80 artillery pieces, over 60 tanks, and those 12 BM-21 rocket launchers.
Comparing these specific numbers provided by the source makes that asymmetrical balance mentioned earlier incredibly tangible, doesn't it? Right there on these new front lines in early 1979.
Absolutely. The source shows that despite the EPLA's organizational changes and strategic withdrawals, they were still facing a vastly superior force in terms of heavy firepower and mechanization on these critical fronts.
Okay, so as we wrap up part 1 of this deep dive, drawing exclusively from the Shabbat source material provided to us, let's quickly recap the major developments this source highlights during this critical period.
Sounds good. We started with the situation in the mid-70s, right? Where the source describes the Eritrean struggle gaining strength, while the Ethiopian army in Eritrea was significantly weakened.
Weakened by the withdrawal of his Western patron, the U.S.
Exactly. This, the source says, allowed the EPLF to make substantial gains, controlling almost 80% of the territory by early 1978 through that step-by-step strategy.
Then, the narrative shifts dramatically. The entry of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, which the source portrays as a calculated strategic move leading to the first largest military intervention in the African landmass since World War II, pouring in that $1 billion in arms, hundreds of advisors.
Fundamentally changing the military balance and, according to the source, prolonging the conflict significantly.
Right, facing this overwhelming, newly equipped and advised force, and with the DERG apparently viewing other fronts as less significant. The EPLF, despite its territorial control, made the strategic decision described by the source to undertake the famous strategic withdrawal of 1978.
Prioritizing the continuity of the armed struggle over holding ground against what it saw as, well, an unwinnable conventional fight at that moment.
Then the source detailed the DERG's massive Soviet-guided counteroffensives in 1978.
Which regained much of the lost territory, but came at a heavy cost, and, crucially, failed to achieve a quick victory.
Forcing the enemy to realize the war was becoming protracted and to plan for further offensives.
And we saw how the EPLA, even while withdrawing, inflicted heavy losses on the pursuing forces through those costly ambushes.
Especially in locations like Alaybird and Mamida Azhara. These ambushes, according to the source, impacted the Derg's strategic objectives, preventing them from reaching the EPLF's main base area as planned.
Then the enemy's adaptation in the third offensive using those sea landings at Marsa Tiklé and Mamimit to bypass land defenses.
Which directly threatened the EPLF base, leading to a necessary EPLA counteroffensive in that coastal area just to secure the base relocation.
And this action, as the source describes, culminated in the establishment and formalization of major, lengthy front lines, particularly the vast Northeastern Sahel Front, alongside the crucial Nakfa Front, spanning hundreds and hundreds of kilometers.
Finally, we touched upon the source's unique portrayal of Nakfa as a town that would never be captured, and the significant organizational shift within the EPLA.
Right, moving from fighting reactively to structuring their forces systematically within these new defined fronts by early 1979.
Despite still facing that heavily armed and mechanized enemy on these lines, as detailed by the source.
So this has been an in-depth look, drawing solely from the Shabbat source material provided to us, focusing on setting the stage, the dramatic shifts, and their early major engagements up to early 1979.
And remember, this was just part 1 of 3 as we explore this specific material.
Part 1 of 3. Based on the picture painted by this source, the scale of the force is now described as being arrayed on the newly formalized Northeastern Sahel Front and the Nakfa Front in early 1979.
Yeah, and the clear indication that a third offensive was being planned, plus the recognition by the generals involved that this war was indeed becoming protracted.
What might be the strategic significance of these specific geographic areas, this immense, newly established Northeastern Sahel line stretching over 600 kilometers, and the seemingly impregnable Nakfa Front in the next phase of the war, as it potentially unfolds in the subsequent parts of this detailed Shabbat source.
Something for you to consider as we pause here before diving into part 2. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into this material from Shabbat.
Reflect on the dramatic reversal of fortunes, the difficult strategic choices, and the sheer scale of forces now facing each other on these newly defined battle lines, all is described in this source. We'll be back with part 2 soon.